I guess it was very confusing. I didn't know, like I said, I didn't know what was going to happen to me. No one I knew was alive. As far as I was concerned, there was no one around me that I actually had any contact with before the war.
G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today is the second and final episode in our mini-series talking about the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. We are joined by Holocaust survivor Peter Halas. Peter was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1939. And when Germany invaded his country in March 1944, it sent Peter's family into hiding. During this time, Peter's mother, along with his grandparents, were shot and killed by the Nazis. In this episode, Peter talks about the impact this had on him as a young child, and how the Holocaust affected both him and others after it came to a close, even years later. He gives a unique historical and generational perspective into mental health. Hello, Peter, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Thank you, and nice to meet you over the phone.
Before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Peter?
I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1939, in October 1939. I lived through the war as a young kid, as a young boy. I was liberated in 1945, but during the Holocaust and during those 5 years, some pretty horrible things happened. My mother was caught up in a raid by the Nazis and she was killed during that raid. My father was on the Russian front as a laborer and he barely survived with his life and then taken to a concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen where he was liberated. But his two brothers didn't survive the Russian winter, and because of lack of clothing and food and medicines and whatever, they perished there. The German invasion happened in March 1944, and until that time, because Hungary was a ally of the Germans, Hungary wasn't occupied like the Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other countries were. And so Hungary, while it was under a Nazi regime, it wasn't as terrible as the Germans, for the Jews anyway, as it was in other places in Europe. And I remember going to synagogue with my grandfather on Saturday mornings, holding his hand. And we had a relatively good life. Even though the war was on, we really had a normal life. March 1944, when the Germans, on the way back from Russia, having lost the war in Russia and retreating back to Germany, occupied Hungary. They questioned the Hungarian government of why they didn't persecute the Jews until then, and the persecution of the Jews started. They started collecting the Jews first from the villages and small towns, and eventually from Budapest. And this is when we were caught up, and my grandfather, my mother's father, decided that we should go into hiding. So we went into hiding with my mother, and my grandparents went into hiding in a different place. And, it was pretty difficult because you couldn't leave. Every time a truck stopped in front of the building, we were worried that maybe they're looking for us. Every time there was a knock on the door, we were worried that maybe they've come for us. Anyway, in December 15th, my mother decided that she can't let the day go by and she must visit my grandfather, her father, because it was his birthday. And when she went to visit him, there was a raid on the building by the Nazis. They took all the Jews to the banks of the Danube River, which runs through the center of Budapest, and they shot them all, including my mother and my grandparents. And after that, my host decided that it was too dangerous for me to stay there. So he put me on his shoulder the following morning and took me to the outskirts of Budapest and found a family who was happy to have me, and they actually wanted to adopt me. And the war was finished probably in Hungary anyway, a couple of months later. And my grandmother, my father's mother, survived in the Budapest ghetto, and she came looking for me, eventually found me, and I went to live with her.
What does it feel like as a young child to lose your mother? How does that feel?
I guess it was very confusing. I didn't know, like I said, I didn't know what was going to happen to me. No one I knew was alive. As far as I was concerned, there was no one around me that I actually had any contact with before the war, or until a couple of months earlier. And I felt pretty alone, but also scared because there were bombings happening constantly. And when I think about what's happening in the Ukraine today and the reports you read in the papers and see on television, It was very similar. I sort of remember being really scared while we were hiding. I remember the shock that I had when they told me that my mother was no longer alive. I was very confused. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. Although the people who I went to live with were wonderful, they were really very kind, and they wanted to adopt me. They wanted to have me as their son. They didn't have children. For the first 2 or 3 months I was with them, Budapest was being bombed from the air by the Americans, as the Soviets were advancing on the ground, trying to push the Germans back. And so, it was a pretty confusing time.
Did it affect you years after losing your mother, or the other experiences you had during the Holocaust?
I'm sure it did. My father came back from the concentration camp a few months after the war finished, and there were lots of people looking for partners. Nearly everyone we knew lost a husband or a wife. And so my father met this lady who lost her husband, and she didn't have children, and they got together, they got married, and she became my mother. And she was a lovely, wonderful woman, and she looked after me like I was her own child. And I think it was later in my life that I remembered my mother more than I remembered at that time. And that so much was happening that everything was a bit of a blur. And then later on in my life, I kept thinking about how life would have been different if my mother stayed alive. Today, I'm now 82 years of age, constantly hovering in my memory.
Did the concentration camp really affect your dad?
Look, he was relatively young. He was, when he came out of the camp, he was about 34, 35 years old. He was very resilient. And just to give you an example, in the camp, when people looked too old to work, they killed them, they executed them, they sent them to the gas chambers. And so to stay looking young, he found himself a piece of broken glass, and he used that piece of broken glass to shave himself every day, even in the coldest winter, with cold water, just so that he would look the part, and he would look as if someone who could actually contribute. And he reckons that what's kept him alive, it saved him from disease, because he washed himself. He said it didn't matter how cold it was. They used ice and snow to wash themselves, and that's what kept them alive. So he was very resilient, and he came back, and there was so much to do to reestablish his life that I think in the beginning he was really terribly busy with that. And then he got married again, and they had another child, my brother Andrew. And I think later on in his life, I think he was more affected, just like I was. Once things settled down, and he sort of felt that things have stabilized. I think that he felt that's when he sort of thought about what happened in the past.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Peter Halas, a Holocaust survivor discussing the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. Did any of the survivors really talk about it much then, or was it just did they just get on with it kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a lot more spoken about the Holocaust today than there was in my youth. We really didn't speak about it. If anyone mentioned what happened during the war, people said, let's forget about it. Let's just get on with our lives. People wanted to bury it in their past, and they try not to think about it.
Do you think it would have been really helpful if mental health had a greater understanding of it back in the 1940s and 1950s?
Look, there was so much happening, and Hungary was virtually under Soviet occupation until the 1980s, and life was very tough. Life was really hard. Food was short. People were afraid to open their mouth. My parents always said, "Look, don't talk about that, because the war's severe. You mustn't criticize the government. You mustn't criticize anything that's happening." And neighbors were reporting on neighbors so that they get some advantage from the government. Everyone was afraid of everyone else. Just because the war finished, there was a short period of about 3 or 4 years when things were looking up, and then once the Soviets occupied Hungary, it was as bad as during the Nazi occupation. You got persecuted for different things, but the persecutions carried on.
And I think those are some really good points, Peter, because you mentioned there, like, today, when we look at, like, the context of today, it's almost like looking back to your context back in the late 40s, early 50s, is that it's really a privilege to today be able to even access, like, and talk about mental health, because it sounds like back in the 40s and 50s that there were other things going on, that there was really not time to talk about it, but like there was just so much other things going on. Like, you you mentioned the government there, and that there was a lot of, dodgy things going on there.
Exactly. No, that's right. I think people, I don't know how, for instance, my father, I came to Australia in 1957, and my father followed me 20 years later in 1977. But he really didn't know freedom until he arrived to Australia. So from 1939 till 1977, he was virtually a prisoner of the systems. First the Nazi system, and then later the communist system, the Soviet system. And he came here. He embraced Australia with such gusto. He was so happy to be here. And he learned English. He was already in his mid to late 60s here, but he learned English. And he and my mother, they went constantly on tours, walking in, whether it was the Blue Mountains or whether it was somewhere else, but every weekend they went somewhere. They just wanted to embrace this freedom that Australia offered them.
When did you start talking about, like, the experiences you had during the Holocaust?
Not till late. I was pretty busy with my business and trying to and building my family and establishing myself. Once I retired, which was around 1990, well, I sold my business in 2015, but I sort of worked less and less as my son came to help me in the business from about the late 1990s, and I started giving my talks and telling people what happened to me during the war around the late 1990s. So that's when I started thinking about it and wrote my story down so that I could see a logical pattern of what happened to me, and sort of understanding of how my life was, all the bits and pieces fit into together.
What did life look like for you between 1945 and 1949, the years leading up to the Hungary becoming communist?
It was pretty good. My father was running his business. He re-established it. We had a nice apartment. My mother and my father and my brother, we were living, like I said, in a nice apartment. My grandmother moved in with us when my grandfather died, so the five of us were having a fairly decent life. We went on holidays in the summer, and I think my father went skiing in the winter. So life was okay. And then in 1949, when the communists took over, it became hard again. The Russians, the Soviets took everything they could from Hungary, starting with food to machinery from all the factories, and it was getting very tough. And also, like I said, communications became very difficult. There was only government-issued newspapers, only government radio stations. There was no television yet. So we didn't hear much of what happens in the West. Quite a few of my family's friends tried to leave Hungary, but the borders were completely closed, and some of them tried to escape. I'm sure you heard of escapes from Eastern Germany to the West. Well, similar things were happening in Hungary. And anyone who got caught were jailed for long periods. Life was tough.
How did you escape communist-occupied Hungary?
Well, in October 1956, there was a revolution. It started much earlier. In March 1953, Stalin died. And from there on, the communist philosophy was getting a bit more people-friendly, if you like. And they were giving all sorts of concessions to Hungary as well. Newspapers from the West started to appear. We could listen to radio stations from outside. There was some private enterprise allowed. And the old adage that if you give an inch, people want a foot, and that's what happened. The university students, in particular, wanted freedom, and once they tasted a little bit of freedom, they wanted total freedom. So on the 23rd of October 1956, we went to the movies with some friends. It came out. There was a procession in the center of Hungary, of about 10 to 15,000 people. And we joined those, and they marched to the radio station. They wanted someone to go and demand and announce the demands of the students on the radio, and instead of allowing that, they started shooting at the crowd from the windows of the radio station. So some of the students went to a nearby army barracks and convinced the commander to join the revolution, what became the revolution. And they handed out guns and they started shooting back. And that's how the revolution started. And for about 5 days, it seemed that the revolution won. Then the Russian tanks came, and it was all over in about 3 or 4 days after that. But what happened during this very short period, they picked up all the mines and acquired around the borders of Hungary. So suddenly, it was a couple of weeks after this, a friend rang me and said, look, we're going to try to get to the west. Would you like to join us? And so the next morning, I joined them, and 5 of us, first by train, and then we got off the train and started walking. And over 3 nights, we reached the border of Hungary and Austria. And middle of the night, suddenly we walking through fields, suddenly we heard German voices, and we realized that we were across the border and we made it. And the Red Cross looked after us for a few weeks. I was in a camp with other Hungarian refugees, and in those days we were the first country under the Russian or the Soviet Union's government that became that had a revolution, and we were treated like freedom fighters. Every country virtually in the West wanted to have some of the Hungarian freedom fighters as refugees and immigrants. So small countries like Switzerland took about 5,000 or 6,000. America took about 40,000. Australia took 10,000 refugees. So there were 250,000 refugees in Austria between the months of November and January 1957. Yeah. And it took about 7 months for me to come to Australia. And there was an American naval boat that took 1,800 Hungarian refugees and brought them to Sydney from Europe in June 1957.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Peter Halas, a Holocaust survivor discussing the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. What did it feel like getting into Australia? Like, how did you feel when you got there?
Look, first of all, it was the 25th of June, middle of winter. It was brilliant sunshine, and it was about 18, 19 degrees, I remember. And I thought, well, if this is winter, I'm happy. Because having left Europe where winter was -20, -25, that was a huge, huge change. My parents had some friends here who organized for me to have a little room in someone else's apartment, and they helped me find a job. It was very easy to get a job, even not speaking any English. I got a job within a day or two of arriving in a warehouse, being a storeman. And look, it was very different. Sydney was a very different city to what it is today. It was the tallest building was a 7-story building at the Caltex house next to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I walked, the first Sunday I was here, I walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, across the city, and I hardly met a person, hardly a car, no cinemas open, no shops open, no restaurants open. It seemed like a very backward place, to be honest. But I was really happy to be here. I felt safe. I felt excited that it was, the opportunity that was offered to me. I was 17 years old and I was on my own, and I thought, well, my life is ahead of me.
Do the experiences of the Holocaust, are they still with you? Like, do they still affect you?
No, they do much more so than it did then. Unfortunately, there is quite a bit of anti-Semitism around if you read the newspapers. And I find it very strange that, all these years after the war finished and we learned what happened during the Holocaust, there is still this completely illogical hatred of Jewish people. It just doesn't make sense.
Did you ever find it hard to kind of open up about the experiences you had in the Holocaust?
I worked with an organization to Courage, it's called Courage to Care, and with the Sydney Jewish Museum. And I go to schools, and sometimes schools come to the museum, and I talk to students. And I've done so many of these talks now that it almost becomes a routine. And frankly, I often think how life would have been different if the war didn't happen. But it's more of just a theoretical, just thinking about it, not really being affected by it, just as a probability of how life would have been different.
Is it important that we talk about mental health?
Yes, I think it's very important.
Why do you think it's important?
Well, it's important because people who have gone through trauma, whether it's the trauma that I went through or whether it's trauma that just a person living in a normal society goes through, then we need to make logic of why the trauma happened in the first place, and could it have been avoided, and what can you do to recover from it? I think as much as I say that I wasn't affected or I didn't feel the effects of the war for a long time, I'm sure I'm a different person than I would have been if the war didn't happen, or if I wasn't there in Hungary at that point.
Well, it was great talking with you today, Peter.
Thank you.
My guest today was Holocaust survivor Peter Halas, talking about the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.